There are some names in American television history that do not just live on in reruns, they live on in the hearts of the people who love them most. Don Knotts was one of those names. For millions of viewers across generations, he was the lovable, wide-eyed, jittery Deputy Barney Fife on the Andy Griffith Show, a man who could make an entire room erupt in laughter with nothing more than a nervous twitch and a sideways glance. He was the kind of performer who seemed born to the role, the kind whose face alone was enough to change the temperature of a room. 5 Emmy Awards confirmed what audiences already sensed deep in their bones. There was simply nobody quite like Don Knotts. But now, his daughter Karen Knotts has spent years stepping out from behind the curtain, and what she has revealed about the man the world so deeply adored is far more layered, far more honest, and far more human than the Barney Fife persona ever allowed the public to see. Through her memoir Tied Up in Knots, My Dad and Me, published through candid interviews, and through her deeply personal one-woman stage show of the same name, Karen has broken a silence that lasted for decades. What she has shared is not a scandal in the traditional Hollywood sense. It is something more profound and more lasting than that. It is simply the truth, and the truth about Don Knotts turns out to be one of the most moving stories in American entertainment history. Before we can understand who Don Knotts became, we have to understand where he came from, and that story begins in a place far removed from the bright studio lights of Hollywood or the polished streets of New York City. Jesse Donald Knotts was born in Morgantown, West Virginia, the youngest of 4 sons born to William Jesse Knotts and Elsie Luzetta Knotts. His mother was already 40 years old when he arrived in the world, making him an unexpected addition to a family that was already stretched dangerously thin by hardship and circumstance. His father, William, had once been a self-sufficient farmer, a man who worked the land and held his family together through discipline and will. But by the time Don was born, that man was unraveling. William Knotts suffered from schizophrenia and battled alcoholism, and the combination of those two forces turned the Knotts household into an unpredictable and frightening place. Don later recalled, with painful clarity, moments from his childhood when his father would hold a knife to his throat during a violent episode. That kind of trauma does not simply dissolve when the morning comes. It burrows into a person. It reshapes them from the inside, alters the way they see themselves, and leaves marks that no amount of success can fully erase. Karen Knotts, drawing on everything her father shared with her over a lifetime and on the deep research that shaped her memoir, has described in interviews how that early burden defined him in ways both visible and hidden. "My dad was very burdened down by all these problems," she told Closer Weekly in an exclusive interview. He had problems with his father and an older brother who tormented him because they were alcoholics. The weight of that household pressed down on young Don without mercy until, when Don was 13 years old, his father died of pneumonia. As difficult as it is to say, that death brought something unexpected: relief. According to Karen, the crushing weight that had been sitting on her father's chest for years began, slowly, to lift. For the first time in his young life, Don Knotts had room to breathe. And into that space, he poured everything he had into laughter. Even before high school, he had recognized that making people laugh was a form of armor, a way of transforming pain into something other people could share and appreciate. He began performing as a ventriloquist, working with a dummy he called Danny, and discovered that when he stood in front of even the smallest audience, something inside him settled. The nervous, frightened boy from a broken home became someone else entirely when he had a crowd to play to. When Don reached Morgantown High School, a transformation took place that his daughter has described with genuine warmth and wonder. He blossomed. He became the person he had always been trying to be inside that dark house on the other side of his childhood. He was elected class president. He had a humor column in the school yearbook called Dots and Dashes by Knotts. He was the most popular boy in his class. He had a best friend, he had adventures, and he experienced perhaps for the very first time what it felt like to genuinely belong somewhere. His whole world changed, Karen said in her Closer Weekly interview. He just blossomed, and he said those high school years were the best years of his life. The world was his oyster, and it was the first time he'd ever experienced such complete happiness, where all those problems fell away. But high school always ends, and the dreams that form inside the warmth and safety of a small-town life have a way of meeting cold, hard reality on the other side. After graduation, Don packed his dummy, his ambitions, and whatever courage he could muster and headed for New York City at just 18 years old. It did not go the way he had imagined. Casting directors looked at the thin, jittery, unpolished kid from West Virginia and passed without a second thought. Too awkward. Too unusual. Not quite what they were looking for. Dejected but not destroyed, Don enlisted in the United States Army during World War II. And it was there, in the most unlikely of settings, that he finally found something close to a real stage. He was assigned to the Special Services Battalion, a unit whose purpose was not combat but morale. His job was to make the troops laugh, and he traveled across the Pacific doing exactly that as part of the Army's touring variety show, Stars and Gripes. He left the service decorated with the World War II Victory Medal, the Philippine Liberation Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 4 Bronze Service Stars, and several other honors. But the decoration that mattered most could not be pinned to a uniform. It was the growing certainty, earned night after night in front of real audiences, that he had something real to offer the world. After the war, he returned to West Virginia University on the GI Bill, earned a bachelor's degree in education with a minor in speech, joined the Phi Sigma Kappa fraternity, and met and married his first wife, Catherine Metz. With a diploma, a wife, and $100 between them, he took New York on again in. This time the city began, slowly, to open. A recurring radio role on Bobby Benson and the B-Bar-B Riders led to a regular part on the soap opera Search for Tomorrow from. And then came the breakthrough that reshaped his entire future, a recurring spot on the Steve Allen Show, where his portrayal of the extremely nervous man in Mock Street interviews turned him into a genuine television personality. Audiences saw something in that twitchy, bug-eyed, stammering character that they could not quite explain but absolutely could not look away from. And then came Andy Griffith, and everything changed again. From Don Knotts and Andy Griffith shared the stage on Broadway in No Time for Sergeants, and in doing so, they discovered a comedic chemistry that very few partnerships in entertainment history have ever matched. It was the kind of connection you cannot rehearse into existence or manufacture through clever casting. It was real, and both men knew it. When Griffith was offered his own television series in, Don reportedly called him half-joking, entirely serious, and told him that any sheriff worth his salt was going to need a good deputy. Andy connected him to the production, the role of Barney Fife was created, and what followed was one of the most celebrated runs in American sitcom history. The Andy Griffith Show aired from, and Don Knotts' portrayal of the perpetually nervous, endlessly well-meaning, thoroughly incompetent deputy Barney Fife earned him 5 Emmy Awards for Outstanding Supporting Actor in a Comedy Series. It is still one of the most decorated individual performances the medium has ever seen. But what Karen has revealed in the years since her father's passing is that the magic did not happen by accident. Behind the cameras, the two friends were genuinely collaborative artists who respected each other deeply and pushed each other constantly. They took notes from each other, Karen explained. My dad would say, "Hey, Andy, could you get me that a little bit quieter?" And Andy would say, "How about trying this or that?" They constantly talked about their characters and their performances. And Andy's loyalty to Don extended far beyond the professional. Years after the show ended, when Don was struggling to find meaningful work and the industry had moved on to newer faces, it was Griffith who fought for him personally. When Matlock was in production and the producers saw no place for a character comedian in a dramatic legal series, Andy Griffith refused to accept that answer. He argued, he pushed, and he kept pushing until they relented and brought Don aboard. Karen remembered it clearly. He kept fighting, and then they put him on. She added, with quiet gratitude, "Everything from the day he met them, he was in my dad's corner." Don left the show after its 5th season in, mistakenly believing the series would be ending. It ran for 3 more seasons without him, and that decision haunted his career for years. He signed with Universal Pictures, starred in comedic films including The Incredible Mr. Limpet, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken, and The Shakiest Gun in the West, and hosted his own variety show in 1970, which lasted only a single season. Later, he found renewed affection from audiences as the bumbling landlord Ralph Furley on Three's Company from. But the 5 Emmy years, the Barney Fife years, those were the peak of something he would spend the rest of his life looking back on with a complicated mixture of pride and longing. This is the part of the story that Karen Knotts has worked hardest to tell honestly, and the telling of it required a courage of its own. Because the Don Knotts she grew up beside was not Barney Fife. He was a real man with real struggles, a man who loved his children even when the weight of his inner life made love difficult to demonstrate cleanly and consistently. Karen Knotts was born on the daughter of Don and his first wife, Catherine Metz. She has a brother, Thomas, born in their parents' marriage lasted from until their divorce in, after which Knotts raised his daughter as a single parent. Karen has described the Glendale, California neighborhood where she grew up as genuinely idyllic, almost like a Mayberry, she told the Murfreesboro Post in a nice, pretty safe neighborhood, almost a small Midwest town community in the middle of the biggest city. Her memories of her father at home are warm and fond. "Life with my dad was so normal," she has said. "He was such a great, multifaceted man. I had a terrific relationship with my dad." But Karen is also unflinchingly honest about the complicated dimensions of the man she loved. Don Knotts struggled with hypochondria for much of his adult life, a condition in which he repeatedly convinced himself he was physically ill when he was perfectly well. He also battled severe anxiety, and the irony of a man who played nervous characters for a living being genuinely, debilitatingly anxious off-screen was something Karen has explored with great care. His pre-performance dread was so overpowering that he could be confined to his bed for hours or even days before a show. Doctors prescribed anxiety medication, and he became dependent on it. He spent years in therapy working through the damage left by his Morgantown childhood, and at one point he was so overwhelmed by the weight of his past that, according to accounts, he cursed at God during a therapy session in his desperation to find release. "I became like a mini shrink," Karen told Fox News describing what it was like to grow up alongside a father whose emotional life was so close to the surface. That kind of proximity to a parent's inner struggle leaves a mark on a child that is not always easy to articulate. It creates a deep empathy. It also creates a constant vigilance, a quiet watching and waiting that tends to stay with a person long after childhood ends. During the early, macular degeneration in both eyes caused Knotts to become virtually blind. For a man whose entire instrument, whose livelihood and identity was built on physical expression, on the face and eyes that audiences had adored for 40 years, the prospect of permanent blindness was not just frightening. It was existential. According to Karen, the diagnosis sent him into a serious downward spiral. His second marriage, to Lauralee Chuckna, had already ended partly under the weight of how he responded to that diagnosis. Fortunately, Knotts was able to have eye surgery that ultimately restored his vision. But the road back was a long one. His third and final marriage came to Frances Yarborough, an actress he had first met years earlier when she was hired to help him learn his lines on the set of a sitcom called What a Country. Despite a considerable age difference, their connection was genuine. Frances said she ultimately fell for his vulnerability, and those who knew them described the relationship as one built on mutual care and real affection. They married even as Don's health was already beginning its final decline, a decline driven by the lung cancer that had taken root from decades of smoking, a habit he had eventually abandoned, but not before the damage was irreversible. Don Knotts kept the severity of his illness quiet for as long as he was able. That was entirely in character for a man who had spent his life using humor as a shield, a way of keeping the most painful realities at a safe distance, not just from others but from himself. Even as chemotherapy became part of his routine, he deflected and joked and kept the gravity of what was happening away from his children. He had survived the blindness. He had survived the anxiety, the failed marriages, the career setbacks, the childhood that should have broken him entirely. He believed, perhaps with the stubborn optimism of someone who had always found a way through, that he could survive this too. By February, Don Knotts had come home from UCLA Medical Center. His condition had moved beyond what medicine could reverse. The chemotherapy had not been enough, and complications from his cancer had overtaken him. He was 81 years old, and the long, extraordinary, improbable journey from that knife-threatened boy in Morgantown to one of the most celebrated comedians in American television history was drawing toward its close. And yet, and this is the part that Karen has spoken about with the greatest tenderness, and the greatest grief even in those final hours, he was still performing. He could not stop. It was not a decision. It was simply what he was made of. When he was dying, he was making us laugh in hysterics, Karen told Closer Weekly. He was literally dying, but he did something or said something that caused my stepmother and me to go into fits of laughter. What exactly he said or did, Karen has kept private. Some things belong to the family alone, and the specifics of that final moment are among them. What she has shared is her own response, and the regret that followed it. She ran out of the room. Not because she was overcome with grief, but because she was laughing so hard she could not bear to stand in front of her dying father doing so. I thought to myself, I don't want to be standing there in front of this man, my dearly beloved father who's dying, and laughing, she has said. Years later, when she shared that story with a director friend named Howard Storm, he did not hesitate. You should have stayed and laughed out loud, he told her. That's what comedians live for. Karen has carried those words with her ever since, turning them over in quiet moments and arriving, finally at peace with them. "He was right," she has said. "I should have just stood there and burst out laughing. Because that's exactly what Don would have wanted." Andy Griffith was there near the end, having made his way to the hospital to say goodbye to a friend he had known for 50 years. Don could no longer speak, but Griffith spoke to him. He told him he loved him. He called him Jess, the private nickname drawn from